In the chilling fog of Victorian London, 1888, there was a part of the city that most of London's upper class preferred not to think about. East of the River Thames, far from the polished cobblestones and gaslit promenades of the West End, lay Whitechapel, a district soaked in poverty, desperation, and smoke. It was a place where horse hooves clattered across cobblestones slick with rain and waste, where hunger haunted every doorway, and where crime lingered like a cold breath in the dark. Here, survival was a daily war, and for women, particularly those forced into prostitution, it was a war often lost. It was into this unforgiving world that the Ripper came. London in 1888 was at once a marvel of progress and a monument to neglect. The Industrial Revolution had transformed it into the largest city in the world. Electricity was just beginning to light up the wealthiest neighborhoods. Railroads stitched together the urban sprawl. But none of this progress touched Whitechapel. Here, more than 75,000 residents were packed into tenements and lodging houses. Many slept 4 or 5 to a room. Alcohol was cheaper than food, and addiction was the norm. Women, especially older ones without family, often had no recourse but to sell their bodies for pennies. The city's East End was a boiling pot of displaced workers, immigrants fleeing pogroms and famine, and London's poorest outcasts. Crime was common. Murders weren't unheard of. But what began that August would shake the foundations of not just Whitechapel, but the entire British Empire. August 31, 1888. In the early morning hours, a carman named Charles Cross discovered the body of a woman lying on the pavement of Bucks Row. The woman was Marion Nichols, known as Polly to friends. She was 43 years old, a mother of 5, and had struggled for years with alcoholism and homelessness. That night, she'd told her lodging housekeeper she had earned her DOS money enough for a bed, but spent it on gin instead. Polly's throat had been slashed twice from ear to ear, nearly to the spine. Her abdomen had been slashed open, exposing her intestines. But there was no sign of struggle, and little blood pooled beneath her. This led the first doctor on scene to speculate the attack had been swift, precise, and likely performed by someone with anatomical knowledge. The killer had struck silently in the dark, then vanished. At first, the press reported the case as a typical East End tragedy. But whispers began to spread among the locals. There had been other attacks recently. Was this just the beginning? September 8, 1888. Just over a week later, another woman was found murdered, and this time the brutality escalated. Annie Chapman, 47, was found in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street in the early morning hours. Like Polly, she was a destitute woman known to drink and frequent the streets. She'd been seen alive just hours before, talking with a man described as shabby genteel wearing a deerstalker hat. Annie's throat had been severed deeply. Her abdomen was again slashed open, and parts of her uterus were missing, taken by the killer. Police surgeon Dr. George Bagster Phillips remarked that the killer must have had surgical skill to remove such organs in dim light, quickly and cleanly. Now, even the skeptical newspapers took notice. The idea of a random madman faded as people began to believe something more terrifying. A methodical killer was hunting the women of Whitechapel. News of the murders exploded across London. The Illustrated Press ran sketches of the crime scenes. Pamphlets with grisly headlines were sold by paperboys yelling, "Another woman slain." Sensationalism took hold. And in Whitechapel, fear became the new currency. The poor, who had long been ignored by police and parliament, suddenly found their neighborhoods swarming with constables. But trust in law enforcement was low. The Metropolitan Police, led by Commissioner Sir Charles Warren, were ill-equipped for what was to come. Detectives had no fingerprints, no forensic photography, no criminal profiling. They relied on crude witness sketches and door-to-door interviews. Theories abounded: a surgeon gone mad, a butcher with a grudge, a foreigner bent on revenge. But no arrests were made. And then, the killer struck again, twice in one night. September 30, 1888. The first victim that night was Elizabeth Stride, found in Dutfield's yard just after 1 a.m. She had been killed swiftly, her throat slashed, but no mutilation followed. Investigators believe the killer was interrupted, possibly by a passing cart. Less than an hour later, the body of Catherine Eddowes was discovered in Mitre Square, a few blocks away. This scene was far more horrific. Her face had been mutilated, nose and cheeks slashed, eyelids cut, and her throat again deeply severed. Her intestines were arranged around her body, and her left kidney had been removed with almost surgical accuracy. Now, the case had crossed jurisdiction lines. Mitre Square was in the City of London, while the other crimes had occurred in Metropolitan Police territory. This overlap created confusion, delays, and conflicting evidence. The killer was growing bolder, faster, more precise. and London was beginning to unravel. In the days following the double murders of Stride and Eddowes, fear gripped Whitechapel like a vice. Patrols doubled. Locals stopped trusting their neighbors. Theories flew like crows over the rooftops. But then came something new, something that gave the faceless killer a voice. On September 27, 1888, the Central News Agency received a chilling letter written in red ink and smeared with what appeared to be blood. It began with the now infamous salutation. "Dear Boss." The writer taunted police, claimed responsibility for the murders, and made macabre jokes about clipping the lady's ears off. He signed it, "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." Though many believed the letter was a hoax, perhaps penned by a journalist looking to stir the pot, it stuck. The name burned itself into the public's imagination. From that moment on, the killer was no longer just a shadow, he was Jack the Ripper, and he was speaking. Then, on October 16, a second, far more disturbing letter arrived, this one addressed to George Lusk, head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. Inside was a note written in a crude, uneven hand and a small box. Inside that box was half of a human kidney, preserved in ethanol. From hell, the note read. "I send you half the kidney I took from one woman." The handwriting did not match the Dear Boss letter. But the medical detail, and the enclosed organ, shook the city to its core. It was real. And even if it wasn't from the killer, the letter was a grotesque echo of the horror still stalking London streets. November 9, 1888, if Polly Nichols marked the beginning, and Annie Chapman signaled the killer's escalation, then Mary Jane Kelly was the symphony's bloody crescendo. Mary was just 25 years old, the youngest of the victims, and unlike the others, she had a room of her own in a dilapidated building at 13 Miller's Court, just off Dorset Street. She was known to be kind, strikingly beautiful, and liked to sing ballads late at night. She was also an alcoholic who had recently quarreled with her partner and turned more frequently to sex work to make ends meet. That morning, the landlord's assistant came to collect rent. No answer. A glance through the grimy window revealed a nightmare. Mary had not been killed in the street, but inside her small, private room. What the police found was beyond comprehension. Her throat had been slashed down to the spine. Her face was flayed until it was barely recognizable. Her heart had been removed. Her abdomen was opened, and organs were scattered across the bed and nearby table. Flesh had been cut from her thighs and hung over a picture frame. The scene suggested something terrifying. The Ripper had time. He had not been interrupted. This was not a rush job. Mary had likely been murdered in the early hours of the morning, and the killer remained undetected in the building long enough to finish his grotesque work. The police were overwhelmed. Inspector Frederick Aberline, the lead detective on the case, later admitted it was the most savage murder he had ever encountered. And then, silence after Mary Jane Kelly's murder, the killing suddenly stopped. No more letters. No more bodies. Just quiet. Investigators hoped the killer had fled or died. Theories ranged from suicide to incarceration in an asylum. Some believed the police had quietly caught the murderer and covered it up to avoid public panic. Others believed he was a traveler who simply left London after finishing whatever dark mission he'd set for himself. The case was never officially closed. And despite endless suspects and a flood of new letters, no arrest was ever made. While the murders ceased, their impact did not. The press had discovered something during the Ripper scare: murder sold papers. Each new killing brought record-breaking circulation numbers. Crime scene drawings were printed on front pages. Street vendors barked the headlines in bloodthirsty tones. The public devoured every word. For the first time in British history, the media had created not just a story, but a villain. More than 200 letters were received, most likely hoaxes. Some were signed Jack, others contained cryptic references to the crimes or threats of future killings. But every new communication kept the terror alive. The case also had a political impact. Whitechapel's conditions became the subject of fierce parliamentary debate. Social reformers pointed to the murders as a byproduct of neglect, poverty, and overcrowding. The East End, once ignored, became the focal point of both national shame and morbid fascination. The Ripper investigation officially named no definitive suspect, but over the years, dozens, perhaps hundreds, have been proposed. Montague John Druitt, a barrister and teacher who committed suicide shortly after Kelly's murder. His death coincided suspiciously with the end of the killings. Aaron Kosminski, a Polish Jewish barber with severe mental illness, who was institutionalized after the murders. A controversial 2014 DNA analysis of a shawl allegedly linked to Eddowes pointed to Kosminski's maternal line, though the evidence remains heavily disputed. Walter Sickert, the artist whose work included disturbing images of women. Modern theorists, including novelist Patricia Cornwell, argued that he was obsessed with the killings and may have painted clues into his canvases. Critics say there is no solid evidence to support his guilt. Other theories point to Freemasons, royalty, and butchers. Some claim the Ripper was a woman, Jill the Ripper. Others believe the killer was a midwife, able to walk bloodstained without suspicion. And a few suggest there was no one Ripper at all, that the murders were unconnected or committed by different hands in a city rife with violence. To this day, no theory fully satisfies. No name silences all doubt. The fog of Whitechapel eventually lifted, but the scars remained. Jack the Ripper hadn't just murdered 5 women, he'd murdered a sense of safety, a sense of order, and the illusion that such evil couldn't lurk so close to home. London was never the same. Birth of the modern murderer. Before the Ripper, murder was personal, revenge, passion, property disputes. But Jack killed for the act itself. The randomness, the brutality, the lack of motive left people reeling. He was the prototype of a new breed, the serial killer. The term didn't exist yet, but the pattern was clear. He killed again and again, with cooling off periods and escalating violence. In many ways, Jack the Ripper was the first modern monster. The case forced police to think differently. Scotland Yard began documenting criminal profiles. Detectives started looking at behavior patterns, victimology, and location mapping. Jack made them realize they weren't just dealing with men, they were dealing with minds. For all the mystery that surrounds Jack, the victims are often reduced to footnotes. But Marianne Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly were not just fallen women. They were mothers, daughters, friends. They were poor, yes, but they were real. Modern movements have sought to reclaim their stories, not as merely victims of a legend, but as women failed by society long before the Ripper found them. Poverty, addiction, abuse, and the city's indifference made them vulnerable. The terror Jack unleashed should never eclipse the lives he stole. In the decades since the killings, new technologies have tried to solve the mystery once and for all. Blood analysis, DNA testing, and geographic profiling have been applied to what little evidence remains. One major development came in 2014, when a shawl allegedly found near Catherine Eddowes was tested. Researchers claimed it held mitochondrial DNA matching descendants of both Eddowes and Aaron Kosminski. But critics quickly pointed out issues, chain of custody concerns, contamination risks, and the fact that mitochondrial DNA isn't specific to one individual. Even with all our technology, the Ripper remains just out of reach. Why does Jack the Ripper still fascinate us? It's not just the brutality, it's the unknown. Unlike most true crime stories, the Ripper case never got a trial, a mugshot, or a last confession. He's a question mark carved in blood. A ghost who disappeared before justice could catch him. He also became the subject of hundreds of books, films, documentaries, and conspiracy theories. From Sherlock Holmes-style tales to horror fiction, Jack is everywhere. His image has evolved, from shadowy cloaked figure to demonic force, depending on the decade. Some believe the mystery will one day be solved. Others think the answer died with him. But maybe we don't want to solve it. Maybe Jack endures because he taps into a darker truth, that evil can hide in plain sight, wear a familiar face, and vanish without consequence. Over 135 years later, Whitechapel is a different place. Tourists walk the streets where the Ripper once stalked. Plaques mark the murder sites. Guided night walks recreate the terror, with lanterns and dramatized whispers. The story lives on, sanitized, commercialized, but still chilling. Yet somewhere in the silence between those stones, a question remains. Who was Jack the Ripper? A barber? A doctor? A madman? A myth? Perhaps we'll never know. But the shadow he cast is long, and his footsteps still echo in the alleys of history.